Good morning. My name is Paul Michel. I'm a retired judge from the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. I thank you all for joining this excellent conference today. I only wish I could be with you in person, but that turned out not to be possible. I have been part of the leadership community since its beginning. And as many of you know, since retiring in 2010, I've been an active and outspoken advocate of strengthening intellectual property rights in the United States. The United States has enjoyed technological and therefore economic leadership for many, many decades. But we can no longer take that for granted. In fact, it is now under challenge. I would say severe challenge. Our innovation ecosystem rests on private market mechanisms, including intellectual property, to create the incentives for the necessary large and continuing investments of money and talent in technological advances. Unfortunately, our IP systems, particularly the patent system, have been degraded over the last decade or a little bit more. And in my judgment, they no longer sufficiently incentivize the large investments in research and development that we need if we're going to win the technological competition with foreign rivals, including China. So many people have the view that intellectual property has something to do with corporate profits, but intellectual property goes way beyond that. It really, in today's world, is a national security issue. There are so many critical technologies that are now the subject of severe challenge from foreign nations, including artificial intelligence, biotechnology, semiconductors, global standards, and many other areas. Unless the deficiency in incentives is corrected, our nation's innovation ecosystem will continue to weaken and our world leadership in science and technology will decline. This has broad and dangerous implications that are somewhat obvious, but not all of them may be uppermost in your minds. That's the point of today's excellent panel. I'm glad that the leadership program today begins with the focus on national security, because that's a foundational insight. The panel will shed light on our nation's technology and tech sovereignty and the goals that we must pursue, and also the role that intellectual property can play, must play, in order to serve these goals. Much of the public policy debate has treated intellectual property as a silo disconnected from economics, disconnected from technology, disconnected particularly from national security. So I will be listening eagerly myself to this panel of national security experts. Each of them has a long list of personal accomplishments and credentials.
Michel, he couldn't be here today because he couldn't travel, but most likely he'll be able to join us. But please join me in welcoming our panelists. Let's start with Dr. John Hamre, President and CEO of the Center for Strategic and International Studies and former Deputy Secretary of Defense, and so many other national security and defense positions in the government. And now we have Ellen Lord, former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment from the US DoD, and former CEO of Textron Systems, and now at the Chertoff Group. We also have Katharina McFarland, Commissioner of the National Security Commission for AI and the Chair of the National Academy of Science Board of the Army R&D. And finally, Rob Atkinson. Welcome, Rob, President of the ITIF, Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He's written extensively about national security and IP. Take it away, John. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. I run the Center for Strategic and International Studies. It's a think tank here in Washington. And Well, we haven't had an audience for 2 years. It's so good to see everybody. It's wonderful to have everybody here. Thank you. I've come to this journey of understanding the importance of intellectual property only in the last year and a half or so. So I bring to it the enthusiasm of a convert. I also have the naivete because I just don't understand it as well as all of you do. So I'm going to ask very simple questions. Fortunately, we have a remarkably good panel here that's going to help us understand the significance of this. The conversation for this session is going to be about why intellectual property is essential for national security, okay? Now, the way I'm going to organize this conversation with these remarkable colleagues is we're going to start with in concentric circles. The first inner circle is going to be about traditional national security. I mean, I tell people national security is spelled both with a small case, NS, and a large case, capital N, capital S, national security. Small case NS is aircraft carriers, bombers, tanks, people, that's small case. Large case national security is the vitality of our economy, the creativity of our society, our ideas industry, the dynamism, the sense of cohesiveness in our country. That's capital national security. And then the third larger concentric circle we're going to talk about is some of the challenges that we're dealing with right now. And there's some very interesting problems that we're working through. So we're very fortunate that for this panel we have Ellen Lord and we have Katrina McFarland, both of whom were senior executives in the Department of Defense responsible for acquisition. And so I'm going to just start, if I can, with them. And by the way, Judge Michel is still with us. He's going to be, I'm going to call on him at the right time. When we start talking about the big problems we're facing, that's when I'm going to bring you in, Judge Michel. So I'll make room for you when we get there. But the first thing I'd like to start with then is just to ask, the most important decision we ever made to win the Cold War was actually a decision we made 30 years before it. And that was when we decided not to build aircraft in arsenals, but to build them in the private sector. So can I just ask each of you, can America go to war without private industry in America? Ellen and then Katrina.
Great, thank you, John, and thank you, Curdy and leadership for having me here today. My perspective is really influenced by 33 years in industry and then very unexpectedly going into government for 3.5 years, working for the Secretary of Defense, having responsibility for acquisition. So I grew up with intellectual property being one of the key products we developed in industry. And only through using the legal system to be able to protect it were we able to monetize it. And obviously, if industry doesn't make a profit, you're not going to be able to reinvest in capital and IRAD and all the rest of it. So in this day and age, unlike in the past, about 99% of the innovation comes from industry. So it is absolutely critical that we harness that industry if we are going to outpace our strategic competitors, as we call them, in this era of near-peer competition, where we were all focusing on violent extremist organizations for the last 20 years or so, very important challenges we had from a warfighting point of view. China and Russia were developing some incredibly complex, very impressive capability. So to continue to achieve overmatch on a world stage, the US military absolutely requires industry where most of the innovation takes place. And not only the large primes, but those small companies are particularly critical because that's where most of the innovation comes from. So I believe our economic security and our national security are incredibly intertwined, and we need to make sure that there's a value proposition for industry to be able to focus the technology out there on our gaps in warfighting capability. And DoD has to streamline acquisition processes and use all of those authorities that Congress has given them, actually implement them to just get going.
Katrina?
John, thank you for doing this, and thank you all for coming to what I think is, of course, a very critical conversation. I think I'm going to pull on a couple of those statements made by my colleagues here a bit, one of which is the big NS and the little ns. And I think the big part of that big NS is the economic strength of a nation that predicts its ability to protect its will. And I think that economic stability has many different roots. And I think when we think of private industry, there's always this comment about the defense sector and the commercial sector. And I think there's some legitimacy beside those words because indeed we don't sell commercial tanks. However, there are aspects, particularly in the New World, where commercial industry and defense industry are starting to merge. And underpinning that is the strength of the nature, as the prior speaker talked. If you want to be able to have a future, you better protect what you consider valuable and be able to develop the means of being able to fund or resource that. And I'll take a little bit more than Ellen's comments and add a little bit of volume to it by saying one of the most critical pieces of that success is predicated on your people, not your policy. So if you have policy, make sure that your people can implement it and that you have adequate numbers of them. And I think part of the process here that we're really poking at is, do we have it right? And I think we can't obviate the past mistakes without learning from them, but take a look at the new world a little differently and see if all of those rules and policies and procedures are adapting. And do you have the people adapted with it? Because it could be a gross failure, an actual opposite of what your intent is, if you do not take your time with your people and make sure you are focusing on those things that will allow them to succeed. So I'll turn it back to you, John.
Thank you. I think probably most of you don't have a background in defense, and so one thing to probably share with you, because I want to bring a question to our colleagues. In the private sector, you live in the world of price, but in the defense world, you live in the world of cost. We regulate our defense industry by what we allow them to charge us as a government, okay? And then we arm wrestle over allowable costs. Now, the question I'd like to ask both of you to reflect on, because you've both been in this world of acquisition, how do you provide incentives when you're also trying to control the cost of a company?
May I take a shot
Please.
at that? Thanks,
Please.
John. I think the era of doing all types of cost analyses and allowing a certain margin and so forth were appropriate when the government was funding the majority of development. The pace of technology is such today that most of that is happening in the commercial arena. So our technology pace has lapped quite a few times our bureaucracy pace and how we do things. Interestingly, Congress first saw this and back starting in about 2015, added into the National Defense Authorization Act, which is the big policy document that comes out of the Hill every year, to start doing some more commercial type acquisition. And that escalated over the years. And one of the things I'm very proud of while I was in the department was that we translated that statute to policy and then very importantly to implementation guidance, which is what Katrina's getting at there. And we started training people to use it. The trouble is that you need to incentivize the workforce to do that. And with all of the military people coming and going and the politicals coming and going, the civilian workforce is not particularly motivated to use what I call creative compliance, using just enough of the regulations to make sure you're doing things legally, but being flexible and adaptable so that you're meeting the needs of the warfighter at what I would call the speed of relevance. So where we have a conundrum now is we have the authorities to do commercial pricing. There is a lot of ways to get things out there more quickly. I won't bore you with OTAs, other transaction authorities, and middle tier of acquisition and so forth, but many, many ways to get things out there. What we need is a demand signal, I believe, on the department to start implementing more of that, because we have the ways to do things. We do not have to go through cost-based pricing. We do not have to wait for the joint staff to go through the requirements process. Because traditionally, if you're going to build a satellite or an aircraft carrier or a fighter aircraft, you go through a very laborious process of requirements for a good reason. The trouble is, any strength used to its excess really becomes a weakness, and that's what the department has done with trying to, basically litigate KPPs and all kinds of, exactly how to do something versus stating what needs to be done and letting the creative industry partners go ahead and do that. So I think where we still have to have some of the cost-based pricing, use all of the mechanisms the department has, frankly, in order to, again, maintain our overmatch and really harness the technology innovation out there, we need to move more towards the commercial pricing. And frankly, what we have in this day and age is we have a lot of systems out there commercially available with just a really incremental change in the form factor or some security there. We could get a step function change in capability. And we need to step up and do that.
So going back to your earlier question, which is we need industry, defense, commercial, small, medium, large. We need it because it's the economic strength of the nation. To your question about incentives and whether and how we can incentivize, we have to understand commercial world, defense world, they've been living in different domains for some time, like you said, price versus cost. And we have to take a good look at our incentives and determine whether our incentives are really working the way they were intended to. There was actually, if folks can have long memories here, in 1970, NASA put out an incentives guide. And to this date, I've never seen anything as good or better than that incentive guide, because they had commercial as well as defense industry working for them. And in defense world, it's cash flow is king. In commercial world, it's product, product, product. How fast can you move? How fast can you deliver? Can you underwrite the rest of your competitive market? And can you get to market the fastest? Well, defense doesn't have those challenges that the commercial world does, but it has a different set of challenges because its customer doesn't necessarily have an even cash flow. It's kind of dependent on whether a bill is issued and whether the appropriations flow through. And it's not got the perfect stream of money to necessarily pay the most efficient and effective way. And to Ellen's comment, requirements tend to take a long time so that by the time the requirement comes out, the technologies move forward. So where do we go to answer John's question? I think there is some real opportunity space here, and I'm going to plug for artificial intelligence. It's my forte, and I really believe in this analytics process. We've been doing it for several decades, but we've decided to plop a neat term on it. Really, it's augmented human capabilities or enabled people to do more and broader things. And one of the things that computers do really well and precisely in accordance with the software programming is the ability to analyze. And I think this warrants an opportunity space because we have ability to compute quicker. Let's take a look and see where successes are and how does that marry to the product that we're trying to procure, and how can we do it in tune with the needs of whether it's commercial or defense to move things forward. Biotechnology, artificial intelligence, chemical industry, material science, our enabling sciences are not something that you can grasp quickly, but they're absolutely the underpinning of our ability to move forward in this new world of digital, right? So we need to really move quickly, and I think there's been a lot of studies. I think the Cyber Solarium, my AI Commission, everybody talked about how do we adapt and bring forward this new era quickly and adjust. And I think to your point, those incentives that we're working with defense industry have been well known and tuned over several decades, but with the commercial world, we need a new set of incentives.
Yeah. May I come back with just one point that I should have mentioned? You know, one of the fundamental challenges with AI and a lot of other things is that software is very different than hardware. And the department still, for about 99.9% of it, treats them the same way. So one of the ways to incentivize industry on software, because I truly believe software is becoming the new platform, the hardware is going to be a commodity as we move forward, is to make sure we build on what was in the NDAA 2 cycles ago, where we bifurcated software and hardware and had a software color of money, because without getting into too many details, you know, you go to jail if you take development money and put it towards production or sustainment, or if you take production money, a different color of money, and use it for sustainment or development, same way with sustainment. What we did with this new software color of money was to run some Pathfinder projects where if you're doing software appropriately, you're developing, implementing, and sustaining all in a big cycle on a daily basis. And we need to do that. That's an incentive to industry to work in a contemporary way with the department. So one of the things is to really develop the demand signal. That's what the department needs, are demand signals to implement some of these.
You know, I'm cheating myself because I would love to take these two marvelous intellects and dig deep into the defense acquisition stuff, but that's we need to move to this larger circle, this larger national security, capital N, capital S, and you know, let me just set the frame for it. I mean, we're now in a great competition with China. You know, the Cold War was not an economic competition. Russia never made anything that we wanted to buy. You know, that was a military and diplomatic competition. This is an economic and technology competition. But, you know, an authoritarian government starts with some big advantages. They've got 4 times the market that we do, so they can support an enormous, you know, base of their companies have this enormous base. Their companies don't have to make a profit. Okay, they don't have cost of capital. The government steals intellectual property for them and gives it to them. The government is now, you know, weaponizing access to their market, you know, so we're in a heck of a competition. Now, one person on this panel here, and this is Rob, he's done more thinking about this and talking about this than anybody. Rob, let me turn to you to offer your thoughts about this great competition with China.
Yeah, thank you, John. So, you know, I think one of the most important issues is how we frame these questions. So I remember being on a panel in the Senate once, and there was a debate about Exim Bank, and one of the free market types was going, we don't need Exim Bank because for defense purposes, because let's say we don't have aerospace or semiconductor, the Defense Department will just fund that themselves. And it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding about what the defense industrial base is. None of the defense primes could survive one day without a robust commercial industrial base, a dual use base, whether that's just directly or indirectly. And the question is, how do we make sure that our innovative companies in a wide array of sectors are able to do that? And John, you pointed out rightly, even with the CHIPS Act, which we advocated for and fully support, and other things, better R&D tax credit, we are not going to match what the Chinese are doing. And the Chinese have those advantages. So what can we do? Well, one thing we shouldn't do is destroy what you can call Schumpeterian profits. And what Schumpeterian profits are profits from innovators, innovative companies that are above the cost of capital, and they use that money to reinvest in the next round of innovation. So if you ever read the new book about Gordon Moore, great book, just came out a couple years ago. You read that book and you see what Intel did over the years. They'd make some money off of a generation of chips, and they didn't give it to their shareholders. I mean, they gave some, but they plowed it back into the next generation because they knew if they didn't do that, they would go out of business. And Qualcomm, all these companies, it's exactly the same model. And yet, what we have in the US now is we have this view, particularly from the anti-corporate progressive left, that says all profits should be at the cost of capital and no higher. And the way you get there is you weaken intellectual property. And so, and the reason they think that fundamentally, is in their mind, in their worldview, the conflict and the tension is not between the US and China, it's between capital and labor. And so this is a total zero-sum game for them. If capital makes money, labor doesn't make money. It's even worse than that. We had a panel with a number of, it was a debate about, are we in competition with China? And I won't say who it is. He's in the administration now. Question came up is, what's more important, defending the US economy, including companies, or defending global proletariat? And the two people on the other side, including the person who's in the Biden administration, said, oh, clearly the global proletariat. In other words, we should put the interest of Chinese workers ahead of the US state. Fine, you can believe that, but I don't believe that. And I think if you go back to sort of what's the core thing at stake here, is does the US have a set of interests that align workers, consumers, corporations, and the state, or do we not? Clearly we do, in my view. And the reason we're beginning to see that more and more is because now we're facing a peer competitor. We talked about that last night, both militarily, they're working as hard as they can, and increasing their defense spending more than we are. And they're doing it on the same thing with commercial. So last point I'll make is we have an antitrust regime in the US that has never, ever considered international competitiveness. It's a very narrow set of sort of framework that both DOJ and FTC do. They don't think about the implications of their actions on US competitiveness. Their only goal is to think about, is it going to lead to more competition? And that may have been an okay goal 50 years ago when we could frankly destroy companies, which is what we did. There was a great FTC case against Xerox where they made Xerox give away for free every single patent and license they had, for free. And the goal of the FTC at the time, according to a leading official, was we're not going to rest until Xerox market share has been cut in half. Guess what? They succeeded. Ricoh, Canon, the Japanese took all of that market share because the Japanese, like that, got every single patent that Xerox had. And that was what we did in antitrust. And the risk today, as we go after big technology companies, is the same. My colleague Julie Carlson is here, who was at the FTC. She just did an analysis where if you take the top 5 US technology companies, they spend 90% of what the entire Japanese business sector spends on R&D. They spend 75% of what the entire European business sector spends on R&D. So just 5 companies. And they spend 1/3 of what the entire Chinese market spends on R&D, business, and government. So my point of all this is we really are running huge risks when we weaken IP, because that's absence of big, heavy-handed industrial policy. IP is the way that lets our companies gain advantage so that they can go out and compete.
Katrina, you were on the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. I mean, and a big part of that commission report was on the great competition for talent with China. Would you just amplify on your findings in that?
Sure. So when John asks about the great competition for talent, it's because, frankly, it's part of this discussion here, much of the intellect that we have in this nation is based on diversity. Diversity of thinking, diversity of backgrounds, diversity. And that has given us a strength. It's given us the ability to have innovation at different levels. When you combine that with capitalism, it really allows for people to have a merit in when they design or develop that incentive. And when you think about that and you think about where we are as a nation, we have been built upon that for decades. But we weren't aware of, and frankly didn't think that everybody or anybody, frankly, would think differently than us, was that there was, and indeed has been, a drain of intellectual property, as we talked before, but also our intellectual education. And we have a concern about that. Economically, it's best if we have the ability to have the best innovation. That doesn't mean that others can't have innovation in the world. It helps strengthen the world. But what we don't like, and we personally, as a nation, believe in ethically, et cetera, is that if it is an origination here and the person put their soul into doing that innovation, that person has the right to the gains or the rewards from it. And having it leak out at any level, whether it's commercial or defense, is wrong. And having somebody develop more abilities based on their theft, I'll call it as it seems to me, and to the Commission, is wrong-minded. And we need to really, as a nation, strengthen our understanding of how we're protecting and where we're protecting that capability to develop people. We believe that there should be an education renaissance. And we should make it and place incentives on the table to bring people here and keep them here. If they're coming here and they're going to get educated, let's make sure, just like the Statue of Liberty says, bring me your hungry, your poor, your oppressed, and have them grow and develop, like I am, first generation, an opportunity space. That doesn't mean that we don't want other nations to be able to do and improve, but we believe in the right of first. If you're the creator, you have the right to enjoy it. Just a little bit more on this topic, a little bit to the left of it. We as a nation inherently are open as a society. And oddly, that has been studied well enough, as you all know, to undermine us. It's tied to this IP. It's tied to us as a nation believing in what is written or told to us publicly. And in the problem in the space of this whole change to a digital environment, I akin it to being old. In my old world, when I was working, I had a file cabinet that I would lock, and then I would lock a door. And if somebody came in to remove a file out of my cabinet, I would hit them over the head with my stapler or something, just to make sure they didn't do that again. And yet, if you were to envision today, what happens all the time is, if it was a file cabinet, there would be people coming in and out of my office pulling files out, and I would just watch them come and go. Because I don't see it, I don't believe it. Now, as a nation, we're starting to recognize that. We're starting to do things differently. But I would encourage you to realize that in every domain, this intellectual property concept is broader than just data rights. And I'll stop there.
Okay, so colleagues, we started by just talking very narrowly that inner circle of national defense, and technology is absolutely vital for us to be able to fight and win, in wars going forward. We opened the circle and we said, okay, the foundation has to be a very dynamic, creative economy. Okay. Now let's widen the circle a little bit to talk about the challenges that we're wrestling with. And Ellen, I would like to start with you. I know when you were Undersecretary, you weighed in on an important issue about standards. You were asked to weigh in. There was a position that was coming up through the Justice Department. You put a defense focus on that. Would you share that with us?
Well, I think the idea here is that we want to make sure that intellectual capability prevails, and that we on a global stage can make sure that we can have the best technology move forward, and that we don't have adversaries just flooding standards bodies with large numbers of people to prevail. We also need to make sure that government isn't making decisions about who has what intellectual property, much to the point that was made about Xerox right here, just because you have a company or a corporation that has developed a somewhat dominant position through this very virtuous investment cycle, if you will. It's not the place of the government to say, too much, start parsing it out to everybody else as well. So the lens that I always had at the table was national security and how is this undermining us. And as Katrina mentioned before, a lot of our intellectual property has filtered out, and now we are not leading in certain areas. So that when DOJ or FTC comes to the Department of Defense for any merger or acquisition or some licensing issues, the question is, how does it impact our national security? And we would go back to that nexus of national security and economic security, and making sure that government doesn't pick winners and losers, and that free markets play out, because it does not end well when we don't. But there are a lot of challenges with that because there's a diversity of opinion throughout the government. And there is something that I did not fully appreciate before joining the government, a very robust what's called interagency process, where all the different agencies, all the different cabinet members, secretaries, and their staffs get to weigh in on major decisions. And sometimes this thought of equalizing things for everybody so everybody gets a chance kind of prevails, because there's a bit of a feeling that that strengthens us as a nation. Whereas I have the exact opposite opinion, that if you do not incentivize companies by allowing them to reap the benefits of what they do, and then have that virtuous cycle growing, we as an economy, we as a global power will begin to atrophy, and it will be a downward spiral. So it's often not for the faint of heart in some of these situations, but it's very important sometimes to pull people into skiffs, areas where you can talk about highly classified things and really lay out what the intelligence tells us about the very nefarious behavior going on, what that's going to result in. So we did a bit of that.
Judge Michel, I don't know if you're able to hear me. I'd like to bring you in at this stage. Can you guys bring him in? Because I'd like to get your thoughts on the whole question about how we're dealing with defending intellectual property these days. You've been a voice in the wilderness.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be a part of this panel and be working with you. You have pioneered educating people about the connection between defense and intellectual property. That's the most encouraging development I've seen in the 11 years since I retired from the court, because without that perspective, I don't see the development of the kind of policy and leadership that the United States needs. In my view, what has happened is that we really do not have an integrated national innovation policy. We have a kind of a private sector innovation system that's worked pretty well. But the government has to set the foundation for this kind of ecosystem to work optimally. And in my view, the government broadly has been failing increasingly for more than a decade. So we have, in the absence of explicit top-down policy from the White House or from the Congress, defaulted to the courts. In my view, the courts are the least able branch of the three to be doing innovation ecosystem policy. And I think the courts have done a very poor job of it. So intellectual property rights have been steadily weakened for more than a decade at the hands of the courts. And the Congress has stood by without reacting. And other than at a rhetorical level, various administrations, both parties, multiple administrations, have failed to provide the executive branch leadership needed. A lot of people think IP is about inventors. I think it's important to remember that intellectual property, particularly patents, are mainly about investors, not inventors. Because if the investors, corporate or outsiders like venture capitalists, are not adequately incentivized to make the large and continuing investments needed for technological advance, it stops happening at the rate we need. And that's exactly what's happened in this country over the last decade. It's actually the reason I retired in 2010 from the court, because it was clear the courts were making things worse in various ways, and that the public debate had to change so that the leadership of the other two branches would activate and give us proper policy. Of course, it's not only about incentives, it's also about investment. Our critical IP agencies, the Patent Office, the courts, the Food and Drug Administration, in my judgment, are seriously underfunded and under-resourced with people as well as dollars. And that's having big consequences. Look at the courts, how slow they are. We talked about speed of action earlier in the panel discussion. A typical patent case to get to final result usually takes 5 years or more. That's just ludicrous in today's world with the pace of technological advance. And on top of that, and of course the courts need more resources along with the Patent Office and the Food and Drug Administration in order to have adequate speed and capacity. So where has Congress been? Well, Congress intervened in 2011 to make a significant change in the patent system with the so-called America Invents Act. It had certain expectations and set up ways of attacking patents to respond to complaints about so-called patent trolls, a very exaggerated threat. And those expectations haven't worked out very well in practice in the 10 years of experience we've had under the new act, but Congress hasn't intervened to make the necessary adjustments to align the activities on the ground with their design and intentions when they passed the bill all that time ago. So my view is that we need much better leadership from the top in the executive branch and from the Congress. And of course, it has to be integrated. In the Senate, for example, the Judiciary Committee has a monopoly on everything having to do with IP, but their view of it is very narrow. It's not connected to defense. It's not connected to foreign affairs. It's not connected to basic economics. So the other committees in the Senate and also the House need to get in the game in an integrated teamwork way if Congress is going to do its job. And above all, Congress needs to understand at a more sophisticated level the realities of incentives in the private sector. So, for example, smaller companies, the very subcontractors Ellen Lord was talking about, who are huge in number, are way more dependent on patent-based incentives than Apple or some giant may be. They're suffering very badly under the serial weakening of IP rights we've experienced for over a decade, and it's continuing apace today. So the impact is not equal. Congress doesn't understand that. So universities, startups, hospitals, research firms, engineering firms, and on, small and emerging businesses are really critically hurt by the current imbalance. And it's all entirely fixable, but only if we develop the political will and provide better input to the top policymakers, particularly in the Congress. And I think this conference is a great step in that direction, and I'm very pleased to be a small part of it.
Thank you very much, Paul. You know, it's the weakening of intellectual property rights has only one beneficiary. It's China right now. Okay, folks,
Yeah,
this is a real
beneficiary.
important issue. Let me just, it was about a little over 40 years ago when we had a great debate in this country, and that was that great debate over private incentives versus public need and public good. And two senators, Senator Birch Bayh, Senator Bob Dole, pioneered a very important framework that we now have for this, which established a framework where publicly funded research can be commercialized. It can be made available. My life depends on a drug. I have to go up and get an infusion this afternoon. It depends on a drug that was started off in a government laboratory and commercialized. Okay, now that probably would never have made it into commercial availability had we not had Bayh-Dole in place. Now, so Rob, I'm going to start with you. There's a battle going on right now about Bayh-Dole. Would you share your thoughts about it?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's important to remember when Bayh-Dole was put in place. Why did they do it? They did it because there was a whole slew of competitiveness and innovation and trade legislation in the 80s. People forget that. An amazing array of things. R&D tax credit, the creation of NIST from NBS, the Federal Lab Tech Transfer Act. You just go down the list, and it was all because we thought, and rightly so, we were competing with the Japanese. Now, and one of the things we did is we have all of this valuable information, all this valuable IP and innovation in universities, and it's not being transferred very much. And so Bayh-Dole said, you now as a university have the intellectual property rights to that. And guess what happened? Universities dramatically stepped up tech transfer because they now had an immediate incentive. And the evidence is clear. My colleague Stephen Ezell has done yeoman's work on this. And you look at it's almost like something like this, where it goes like that, Bayh-Dole passed, and it goes up like that. What's going on today? Well, what's going on today is as I talked about before, there's an anti-IP movement in the US, largely driven by people who don't think companies should make a profit. And they see Bayh-Dole as a key barrier to that. In their mind, it gets even worse than that. Literally in their mind, you shouldn't have drug companies. All drugs should be developed by the NIH. If anybody knows anything about drugs, anything about biotech startups, you know how ludicrous that claim is. And yet, that is what many of those folks say. And Bayh-Dole sort of gets in the way of that because it allows universities who are getting NIH funding or NSF or DARPA to then license that technology. And what do they do with the money? They spend it on more university research or helping faculty. Oh my God, we don't want that to happen. So, John, one of your interesting points about that is, we talk about copying other nations now. Bayh-Dole is probably the single most copied US innovation policy ever. There are scores and scores of countries that do that. What's interesting is Russia doesn't do that. And I was talking to a Russian tech transfer person, and he said, our universities just have no interest in doing this because if they license something, the government gets to keep the money. So they're like, why waste our time on that? So we aligned incentives the right way with Bayh-Dole, and yet it's, The Economist magazine one point said it was the most successful tech policy of any government ever, and yet there's an assault on it, largely to do what's called march-in rights, which is to go and say, oh, we're going to take your IP back if a company goes to a university and says, hey, in a negotiation, and those universities, by the way, are very sophisticated. They want as much money as possible, and so it's an equal buyer-seller relationship. And what they want to do is, if the company's licensed it, they want to be able to have the government go in and say, no, we're going to take that IP back. So I think it's very dangerous just in and of itself, because Bayh-Dole is a really critical tool we have, but it's dangerous on the precedent and the direction it's setting, which is to weaken IP rights overall.
Either Katrina or Ellen want to jump in on this?
If
Katrina?
I think what he just said was so important to understand. The history behind this is very clear in its data. And even right now, there's a challenge to reinstate SBIRs, Small Business Innovative Research funding and approvals, of which, telecom comes from SBIRs. I think the government putting a bit of seed money out there is underrated when they think of the leverage that it provides, to that very point that certain investments aren't going to naturally come out of the commercial world. And having run the Army's medical research, which pretty much is the underpinning of almost all the medical, you wouldn't have it happen in the commercial world if it didn't have, again, an incentivizing entity. One last point, though. The government, when it comes to national security, has a balance between public good and national security to constantly deal with. And when we are not at war, it balances towards the public good. And then when we have conflict, it balances towards national security. And I think that that should be an acceptable place to live. And instead, what we try to do is constantly tweak these rules. Intellectual property in the hands of the government is only useful when the government exercises its right and actually uses the intellectual property to protect the public spend and value, which is the product to protect our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines. So we really need to think about IP in terms of the federal government, of that balance between public good and national security. But my challenge in front of everyone is, do we have the people that know how to do that? In the government, it's a GS-12, GS-7, wonderful people. But they have, and if you've ever seen the Federal
So
Acquisition
just
Regulations,
tell people that would be like a sub-director level in
Right.
a company.
And
So it'd be
train-
maybe a manager, maybe a supervisor.
yeah, so they come out and they hold a book. It's called the Federal Acquisition Regulations. It's this deep. And they're supposed to be able to consume to the art level, right? That information and be able to differentiate on top of just contracting law, engineering, which is it technically IP or is it not?
So I think these are all proof points that Rob had and Katrina had to the fact that we do not have enough people in government with business acumen. And it's somewhat horrifying sometimes to see on both the Hill and on the executive branch the lack of understanding about how a company actually works. You need the cash flow to pay people at the end of the week and so forth. So there's a fundamental concern that I have that I saw being sort of an outlier, having spent a lot of time in industry, then going into government, that people don't know how things work. And we have a lot of very smart people in government from a policy point of view, a lot of smart technology people, but we need more people that understand business to connect the dots. And a lot of what goes on is totally uninformed about what industry can actually do or not do, what a board of directors will approve for capital, infusion. So that's, I think, why, for instance, the Defense Production Act, Title III, one of the silver linings of COVID is people realized that there is a small bit of money in government speak, a few $100 million a year, that is being put towards companies to put in facilities, equipment, tooling, training, or developing supply chains to get over that activation energy that you can't if you don't have a virtuous business cycle where you're going to make the return. So we need more and more of these things. And one final last plug is just from an acquisition point of view, the acquisition professionals within DoD do not get a lot of input from outside of government. And there's something called the Defense Acquisition University that's predominantly at Fort Belvoir, just south of DC here. And for the programs that first-time program managers, so it's like the first time you manage a bunch of people for a lot of money that you're responsible for, and then the course that's for the first-time program executive officers who now are managing managers and so forth, they love to have people from industry come in and lecture because it is so eye-opening. So if just 2 of you in this audience today reached out to Jim Woolsey, he's the director down there, and said, may I come and talk to your program managers, your PMs, your PEOs, that would be an incredible success story from my point of view out of this panel.
And you headed
Yeah, I
up
was the
Defense
president.
Oh, yeah.
Acquisition
We used to have
Yeah.
tons of industrial people come through. And the challenge is this interesting distance between government people and industry people. For some wanton reason, we want to have them pay for the education. And what we really need to do is have basically slots that are available to industry to come in. But I'll pull this last
So it's just so
thread.
people are clear, it's like 5% of each class might be taken up by industry who can come if they
Right.
want to pay.
Yeah. So John and Ellen, I think there's an underpinning in this discourse, and that is that Ellen is the opposite of me in terms of background. I started as a GS-7 entry-level civilian and then left and now work in industry for the last half decade or so. Ellen started in industry and ended up in government. I think what it's important for you to hear is the commonality in views and yet some of the distances. And one of the things that are very important to me as a public servant and also now as a common civilian, if you would, is that I believe strongly that we have something wrong when we cannot bring in people from industry and rotate people into the government and vice versa. If I can hold secret clearances like I do, I think I can protect national security, and I think I can go into business and industry equally. And that I've presented to many of the Defense Business Board and other entities that have done some analysis on do we have the right mix. Because unless we have this balance, we will constantly be at odds on coming out with a best product.
Yeah.
You have to walk in somebody's shoes, the Indian said. So
Yeah.
I recommend strongly that we think about how do we allow for that turnover to occur and protect that.
Yeah, there are a bunch of small programs for internships, but it all gets hung up in the Office of General Counsel because people from industry will come in and do sort of a fellowship thing for a year, and then they're recused from everything they want to work on that's related to what they did in government. So I agree, it's a huge issue.
There's this big barrier that's emerging, which is not going to be good, the barrier between private sector and government service. But just to wrap up on Bayh-Dole, if you go back and look at the legislative record, the march-in rights provision was there to prevent a company from buying the license and then sitting on it because they thought it was competitive against a product they already had. So Bayh-Dole's march-in rights was designed to protect the consumer. It's being inverted now. And so it's really a profound problem to have this campaign going on right now. One last thing before we open up to all of you, and I apologize, I've taken too long, but I'd like to just talk a little bit about standard setting. The American approach to standard setting is to put the responsibility on the private sector. In our system, it's the private sector that comes together. The government does not set standards in America, except for very unique government things. But largely standards are developed in this country by the private sector. The role of the government is to basically be a partner to the private sector as it develops fair, transparent, so it's a transparent process and it's fair and open. Now, China has a state-centric approach to standard setting. And if anybody goes to a standards conference these days, half the room is Chinese interns looking at how to do this. They actually have a 5-year plan, to get control of global standard setting. What would that mean for us?
Huge bad. So if you think about standards, they were supposed to be based on equity and ability for people to contribute without having to have unique capabilities. And what I mean by that is interoperability I'm going to use because it's most personal to me. Command and control, in the terms of a military operation, you want to be able to make sure you have full understanding or as much understanding of the battle space so that you don't shoot your own people and you're having the right target on the right. You don't want to shoot at Chicago when you're aiming at some other place. So when we built standards, they were supposed to provide for anyone being able to compete for access to the work and yet allow for the boundaries of protection to what needed to be protected. Think of that now taking it one level higher, nationally. I'm going to have the ability in a free world to have 5G. If it's built in my image as a free, open society, I won't conduct surveillance. But if I have a 5G developed by a country who believes in surveillance, that's what I'm going to get. So infrastructure is not just an element of accepted, it's just there, assumed away. Infrastructure provides for us the means of doing what we need to do as a nation and globally. So we naturally would like to have our image, our beliefs, our freedoms instituted in that. And economically, it's sounder to have a competitive environment vice an autocratic or singular environment. Ellen, you can...
Well, and I think if the government were to set standards, that presumes the government has the subject matter experts to do so. And one of the challenges with not being able to rotate people in and out of the government for 2 or 3 year stints, and there are a lot of people that would love to do that, but for legal reasons, you can't do it. You do not end up with many government employees that are cutting edge in terms of their knowledge of different technologies. So it would be a very tortured process from my point of view. I mean, security standards, I can see that for certain things, safety/security, but overall standards, that would be a death spiral from my point of view.
Rob.
I guess I would look at it a little differently. You know, for really since the WTO accession of China, we had this deeply held view in Washington, which was that they're going to become like us. It's just a matter of time because our system is superior. And that fell apart, started to fall apart at the end of the Obama administration, crashed and burned in the Trump administration. Now we're like, hey, wait a minute, I don't think they're going to become like us. And one of the ways that we thought they were going to become like us was standards. Okay? I mean, our standard system is the best, except now when you deal with China. So, John, I don't think their standards process is really government-led. What it is it's corporate-led, government-guided. So, for example, there was a case, I don't know how many, a few years ago, I'm sure people know better than I do, but it was some computer standard, and Lenovo decided they wanted to side because with sort of the US, Europe kind of approach because they thought it was the best thing for their company. And they're basically told that their kids would go to a concentration camp if they went along with that. That was a joke. And so they sided with the Chinese companies. So if you think about that for a minute, we would never do that in the US. We would let companies hash it out and fight it out, and may the best person win. That's not what China does. And I think for us to say, well, we'll take our system against their system, and we hope to win in international standards bodies, I think is frankly naive. I don't see how you can do that. So we've got to figure out another way to deal with that. And you know, one idea we've had for a while is, if you think about why do we have an R&D tax credit, it's because economists shown very clearly there are big, massive externalities from R&D. In fact, one study by Nordhaus back in the 2000s, he, very famous economist, he found that innovators get 3% of the total returns from innovation, even with patents. The rest of them go to us, all the people in the company. So I think one of the things we should do is we should allow standards expenditures to qualify for the R&D tax credit, because standards is essentially a public good, and American companies, when they participate in standards, they're helping their own company, that's for sure. But they're also helping the overall US society, US economy, US national interest, and they don't get paid for that.
That's great.
So I think that would be one idea. The other idea would be, you know, figuring out some way to collect, where we could all get together, you know, the European companies, the Japanese companies, the American companies, and recognize what's going on there and figure out a way within that voluntary, open, contentious process to limit the Chinese manipulation, because that's what it is. You know, I'm fine with Huawei fighting for this. That's fine. That's a legitimate thing. But when it's the government pulling the strings behind, and that's what I worry about. And they have had some victories there, which they shouldn't have had.
Just, if I may, just one little personal example on why we don't want the government to set standards. When I was the deputy secretary, the Congress actually defined what a supercomputer was in law, and said a supercomputer could not be was anything more than, I forget what it was, 7 million megaflops a second or some damn thing, you know. Well, Craig Mundy, who was a friend of mine who was at Microsoft, came in and says, the Game Boy is going to exceed that in 2 years, you know? I mean, you do not want to have government define it, because we do that by politics, not by commercial potential. Okay, we've got just about 10 minutes left. I'd like to open up to the floor here for questions. Do we have microphones to move around? We've got one over here, and
there's one here and one over there.
there's a question right here at this table. And then please just put your arm up, and then back here, we'll come up.
All right, thank you very much. This has been a very stimulating discussion. Chuck Western from Georgetown University and CSIS, as I think you know.
Thank you.
Just a couple quick points to be short. And I mean them to be tough questions. We talked about other transaction authority. DARPA makes it hugely success. It's one of the conditions of DARPA's success. So we don't imitate it elsewhere. Very hard. Why is that, and why can't they get the main structures to use it more? It's on the books. Second question. DARPA brings
Maybe
in...
we should answer those one at a time because we might not be able to remember them all.
No, go ahead, and I'll keep
Trust me,
track.
they're
I'll
pretty
keep track.
short. DARPA rotates in. I think it's Price Waterhouse or Deloitte. They're all over the place in the agency. Why can't that be applied elsewhere? The SBIR, which is known as SBIR only in some parts of the Department of Defense, but it's a small business award program that has proven hugely successful, and that's why they don't expand it. And why don't they expand it? We've actually interviewed senior officials. They say, this works so well. Well, once you had money in it, oh, well, no, why would we add money into something that works really well? So I'll leave that point.
Okay, I'm going to let each of you take
So
take
OTAs.
SBIR.
You can take OTs. They're
Okay.
all over the place. Go ahead.
Okay, so other transaction authorities, it's an acquisition methodology where you don't have to know exactly what you're buying because requirements are such a big deal. And that was one of the biggest shocks I had when I moved from automotive to aerospace and defense during my career. So like everybody said, what's in the contract? What's in the contract? Everything has to be legally done. And we spend incredible amounts of time at DoD getting the requirements right. Other transaction authorities can say what we're trying to do, and you don't have to go through the cost disclosures as well. It is a really fantastic opportunity to get commercial companies in because the FARs, the federal acquisition requirements, and the defense federal acquisition requirements, you don't have to meet those. So it's kind of like the fast lane to get capability fielded. The challenge is twofold. One, the department does not do a very good job of training and incentivizing acquisition professionals to use these things because everyone is scared to death of two things. One, a program failing, which things fail in life, right? But the media focusing on them being the acquisition official that let that happen, so to speak. And then two, getting hauled up to the hill on a hearing with all kinds of bright lights, television cameras on you, getting grilled by congressmen and senators who are really, playing back home. So there have been a couple areas where OTAs were abused with big, large procurements, and unfortunately that got all the media attention. So basically we need to train and we need to say, okay, mistakes were made, deal with those, but go forth because it is a way to really get going.
So I'm going to take SBIRs on because that to me is a particularly fond element of our work. Small business innovative research is a tax that's applied to programs. So when I go forward to get money for a program, I budget for the level and it's very carefully scrutinized. But when the money comes, I'm going to have a certain percentage taken off that I lose, and I have to find a way to take it out of hide. But that money can be used for innovation, so as much as I was a program manager, I kept that money and I spent it for good things, where I couldn't get money through the regular appropriations process. I personally have seen people slow down on SBIRs because it competes with big business. It competes. And the other place that I've noticed a problem with SBIRs is the fact that I'd like to have appropriated funds for SBIRs. The problem is, if you take a look at the congressional process, if I can't define specifically where the constituency is that I'm going to spend it, I'm going to have a problem getting it. So SBIRs is a fabulous tool, needs to be renewed. We need to think about how much evidence that GAO has put on the table and the services have put on the table of how valuable it is as a tool, and protect it and perhaps increase the percentage, even to keep abreast of the interest rate would provide value. So I'm all about SBIRs, love to have some additional tools. OTAs, I ran the 2 largest ones in the country, the ones for the Missile Defense Agency, which are in the billions. They work fabulously as long as you understand there's a problem for transition from the beginning to an actual fielded product. That's an issue because you have to have somebody who's got the commit to scale to get to produce it. There's some interesting bridge work being done in that area right now. What was the third one you had?
DARPA.
DARPA doing,
They
bringing
their
industry
model
through.
of bringing people in and out 2 to 3 years at a time.
Well, let me just, there are 3 reasons why DARPA works and why it doesn't work anyplace else. The first is Congress has given the director of DARPA unusual authorities to move money. So in any other R&D line in the Defense Department, you can't move more than $4 million from one R&D line to another without permission from the Congress. DARPA can move $100 million tomorrow if they want. Second reason is that program directors are only allowed to serve for 5 years. So there's no empire building. It's long enough for you to prove that your idea works or doesn't work, but it's not judged a failure if you don't. And the third thing is you can fail at DARPA, and that's okay. Now, it's the only part of the federal government where we say it's okay to fail.
Yes.
You know, I mean, everybody else, you're crucified by the Congress if you fail. But there's never been a hearing where the Congress has crucified DARPA for having a project that didn't work. So it's very unique qualities, and it's the reason why it's never worked anyplace else. We've got time for one more question. I'll get right back here. Here, yes, please. I'm sorry, our time constraints.
Thank you, Mom and Dad, from Mason University, from Data Center. Question is regarding standard essential patents. Essential standards set by the private sector are very important. The current administration now is a variety of actions to take a position that returns on patents should be sharply circumscribed if they read on standard. These patents are very important for the transmission of technology. And also, there's a real risk of bringing antitrust suits against such standard essential patents. And I just thought people may not be aware of that, but anyone perhaps from Atkins and perhaps somebody else might want to comment on the importance of giving strong returns to patent holders whose patents help improve and create high-quality standards that's so important to the American economy.
Paul, Michelle, were you able to hear that question?
Well, to an extent, John, but it seems to me the important thing to focus on is the core, the linchpin of why the patent system works. It works because of the threat of exclusivity, the threat of an injunction. And the policy debate now about standard essential patents is to try to remove the availability of injunctions, the key part of the whole system. In the case of standard essential patents, it's absolutely a horrible idea. It's like all the other horrible ideas that have been mentioned today. You can either have policy based on facts and evidence, or you can have policy based on political muscle and campaign contributions, and it's obvious which is going to secure the future of the country. And the standard essential patent / injunction debate is just one more instance of that dilemma, and we need to get it right.
I don't know enough to say much intelligence about that, but my colleague Julie Carlson does. And I'm not calling on you, Julie, but we did a filing. She did a filing with DOJ a couple
We've got a
of weeks
microphone
ago,
over there. Why don't you
and
offer-
called for a third way on SEPs. So
Let's. I'm sorry. Let's.
I didn't mean to
hear
put you
that
on the
comment,
spot,
and
Julie,
We'll make
but-
that the last.
Thanks, and I think Alden raises a really great point here, and I think sort of the history in this space has shown that the agencies very much believe antitrust liability applies to seeking injunctions with respect to standard essential patents. What I think the agencies haven't done a very good job of, though, is saying what are the obligations of implementers of standards. And so it's very much the case that you can just sort of stand up in court and say, I'm willing to license, and that's all you have to do, and now patent holders can't seek injunctions because you've declared you're willing. Except for, you don't have to do anything else. And so these negotiations can go on for years and years where the implementer knows at the end of the day, because of the FRAND obligation, this fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory obligation that the patentees have made, that they're only going to have to pay that FRAND royalty at the end of the day. And so it's a real problem for the patent holders who face, I think, real antitrust liability for using a tool that will bring implementers to the table.
I can't talk right now. Okay, thank you very much. There's a very simple mission statement for government, which is it's the role of government to survive as a nation and to prosper as a people. That's what government is supposed to do. I hope what you've heard this morning is the very vital role that intellectual property plays in both of those dimensions, to survive as a nation, to prosper as a people. Would you please thank these colleagues with your applause? Just a second, please. I need to.